So folks, later, if you come up here, this escalator will bring you to this spot. Obviously, we've walked through the souvenir photo stand. This is the cafe, the restaurant and bar are behind the cafe. Okay?
All right.
Now we're going to go there. All right, folks, before we look out the windows, I want to show you where in the building we are. So let's go over here. This, by the way, is a new installation just opened this morning.
Wow.
It's all about the product Moleskin. They make stationary products. And they've sort of combined with artists to do all sorts of different artworks within the notebooks that they produce. So it's kind of fun. You might want to check it out later. But let's talk about the building. So I'm going to stand over here because I don't want there to be glare on my tablet. So this is the building you're in. It's called One World Trade Center, right? And it is one of several new World Trade Center buildings that have been built to replace the original World Trade Center that was destroyed on 9/11. And we will see all those new buildings and talk a little bit about the old buildings on the last stop on the tour. Okay? So, One World Trade Center, it is an office building. Every day someone will ask me who lives in the building, and the answer is no one lives in the building. I feel like I live in the building, but nobody lives in the building. So what you got here from the 20th floor, which is where I'm pointing, to almost the top, these are the rental floors businesses rent out to do their business. The largest tenant in the building is a company called Condé Nast. They publish high-end magazines. Vanity Fair, Vogue, The New Yorker, right? And there are dozens of smaller companies as well in the building. Now, the first 19 floors down here, that's where you find the building lobby, and it's also where you find mechanical floors. Mechanical floors are where you put equipment to run the building, heating equipment, air conditioning equipment, water tanks, things like that. There are also mechanical floors up near the top. And sandwiched between two levels of mechanical floors is the observatory. So that's where we are. So I'm going to zoom in to the top of the building to give us an even closer look. So right now we are on floor 100. And that means we are 1,254 feet. 1,254 feet or 382 meters above the street. Okay? And where we are right now is 4 feet higher than the rooftop of the Empire State Building, just to give you a sense of comparison. Right? Now, above the observatory are some of those mechanical floors. Then comes the rooftop. Rooftop height, 417 meters or 1,368 feet. That is the same rooftop height as the original Twin Towers. And that's not a coincidence. The designers of the building wanted the memory of the Twin Towers to be part of the building, so they matched the rooftop height. Now, the Twin Towers ended at their rooftops. Our building keeps going. We have a pointy spire that sticks above the roof. It is not an antenna, like a lot of people think. It is a spire. A spire is an architectural feature meant to complete the building. Think of it like the steeple on a church, right? If the steeple were missing, the church would be unfinished, right? If our spire were missing, this building would be unfinished. So since the spire is part of the building, the height of the spire is the height of the building. 541 meters, which means nothing to us Americans, right? But if you convert that to feet, you get 1776 feet. And 1776, of course, is the birth date of the United States. It's the year the Declaration of Independence was written and signed, right? So they wanted to achieve two symbolic heights. The rooftop height, same as Twin Towers, the spire height to match the date of the birth date of the country. Now that height makes this the tallest building in New York City, the tallest building in the United States, and the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. but the sixth tallest building in the world. Over in the Eastern Hemisphere, the Middle East and Asia, there are 5, soon to be 6, taller buildings. So, any questions about the building? All good? All good? Great. Let's look out the windows. So, our first look is facing west. And I would love to say, behold New York City. I can't do that because what we're seeing is New Jersey, right? It's another state entirely. New Jersey, because it's a state, has its own cities. And we can see one right across the road. That's Jersey City, New Jersey. In the distance, in the haze, you see a large built-up area. That's Newark, New Jersey. To the left of Newark is Newark Airport. If any of you flew into Newark Airport, that's where you are. The water that separates us from New Jersey is called the Hudson River. The Hudson River starts way up north, flows down, and ends right here. The water from the Hudson fills New York Bay, where the Statue of Liberty is standing, and then the water exits the bay through the Verrazzano Narrows, under that big Verrazzano Narrows bridge. On the other side is the Atlantic Ocean. So this arrangement of water, right? Atlantic Ocean, New York Bay, Hudson River, makes New York one of the best natural harbors in the world. New York is a seaport. It has been a seaport since the days of the Dutch. And this seaport economy has driven the economy of this area for 400 years. Right? Something a lot of us New Yorkers don't think about because we're too busy looking in. If we looked out into the water, see lots of ships, lots of stuff going on there, right? Which we mostly ignore, unfortunately. Now, the Statue of Liberty. I'm sure you all recognize her, right? It's the one landmark I don't have to describe. Just point to it, everybody knows it. So, the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France to the United States. The French helped us win the American Revolution. They helped us beat the British, right? And since they were partially responsible for giving birth to the United States, they wanted to give us a 100-year birthday present. And that birthday present was the Statue of Liberty. Look, we're having a birthday party. The birds are flying in the sky. Oh, that's fun. I don't see that very often. That's cool. Anyway, so 100-year birthday present, the Statue of Liberty. Now, let me show you my favorite picture of the statue. So if you look at this image, it shows you the outside of the statue and the inside of the statue, right? And you can see from this image that the statue is hollow, right? A colleague of mine likes to say the Statue of Liberty is like a giant chocolate Easter bunny in the shape of a woman made out of copper, right? Not chocolate, unfortunately. So copper, of course, is a metal, right? And that metal, that skin on the statue's sort of outer shell is not very thick. If you took 2 pennies and squeezed them together, that thickness is thicker than the skin on the Statue of Liberty. And so she needs a little support on the inside to keep her standing. That support comes from a sort of skeleton, originally made of iron, now made of steel, right? That holds that outer shell standing, right? And it also enables visitors to climb inside the statue. Now you asked, could people go inside the Statue of Liberty? Before COVID, you could. You could go all the way up to the crown of the statue. Then once COVID hit, they stopped letting people do that. I think they still haven't opened her up again. Okay, but that's got to be happening soon. It's got to be happening soon. Yeah. So this was the gift. The craftsmen of France built her in hundreds of pieces and shipped the pieces across the Atlantic Ocean. I tell people, when they reassembled the Statue of Liberty, she went up like an IKEA bookcase, right? Like a kit, basically, because she was already in pieces. Now, the statue stands on a pedestal made of stone. The pedestal was not part of the deal. It was not part of the gift. It was up to us Americans to pay for it and build it before the statue could go on top, right? And that sounds like a pretty simple thing, not a problem, not difficult. Turned out to be the biggest headache of the whole project. In the 1870s, when all this is going on, the United States is suffering through a recession. It was almost a depression. It was so severe, right? And when the organizers approached the federal government and then the state government, both governments said, you know, we don't want to seem like we're wasting taxpayer money on something that seems frivolous and unimportant. So they refused to pay for the pedestal, right? So finally it was left up to ordinary Americans to donate money on a voluntary basis. And so today we call this crowdfunding, right? Back then it didn't have a name and it had never been tried before. And so people were very reluctant to give money, especially since money was so tight because of the recession, right? Most of the donations were less than $1. But eventually they got enough and they built the pedestal, put the statue on top. The whole thing was done and finished by 1886, a little bit longer than they had hoped. But I tell people she was worth waiting for. Right? Yeah. All right. Now, you'll notice to the right of the Statue of Liberty is an island, a square island. That's called Ellis Island. Ellis Island is where immigrants processed to become American citizens. From 1892 to 1954, 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island. Now, among those 12 million were my grandparents. Right? They came from Italy, they went through Ellis Island, and they settled in the New York City area. Right? So many immigrants passed through Ellis Island, it's estimated that 25% of all Americans today trace at least one branch of their family tree through Ellis Island. Now, about 1/3 of that 12 million, like my grandparents, settled in the New York City area. But that left about 8 million immigrants who had no intention of living in the New York City area. They had friends, family, jobs somewhere else in the United States. So those folks had to get to those places and meet up with those people. And the way they could do that was to head to our next landmark. So you see that very impressive building right at the edge of the water. It's got those 5 piers in front. That is an old train station. It's called the New Jersey Central Railroad Terminal. It no longer functions as a train station. The train stopped running decades ago, right? But when the immigrants were pouring in, that was a very busy place. Millions of immigrants, folks from New York, folks from New Jersey, they'd head to that building, buy a ticket, get on a train, and go fill up the United States. So, 3 very important landmarks: Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, New Jersey Central Railroad. Any questions before we leave this one? Okay, let's head to the point.
So they move from island to island by boat, I assume?
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
That little bridge that connects Ellis Island to New Jersey was only built in the 1980s.
I see. Wow.
Okay. So now we're facing north, right? Or as we New Yorkers say, we're facing uptown, right? New Jersey's still over there on the left. Got a great view of the Hudson River. And of course to the right is the famous skyline of Manhattan. Before I talk about Manhattan, I want to talk a little bit more about the Hudson River. First thing I want to point out, in the distance is a large bridge. It connects northern Manhattan to New Jersey. Can you all see that? Yes. That is the George Washington Bridge. It is officially the busiest automobile bridge in the world. Wow. I mention that because all those folks from New Jersey, they know that in their heart, but they may not know it in their head. So I have to tell it to them, okay? The busiest bridge in the world. Now, something else related to the Hudson River is something I get asked about all the time. Everybody wants to know, where did Sully land the plane?
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So let's start at the beginning. It's January 2009. Plane takes off from LaGuardia Airport. It's full of people. It's heading to Charlotte, North Carolina. As it climbs into the sky, it hits a flock of Canadian geese. Those geese get caught in both engines, disable both engines. So the plane cannot keep flying. The pilot, his name was Chesley Sullenberger. Everyone calls him Sully. That's his nickname. A very experienced, skilled pilot. He realizes he's in trouble, right? And he basically concludes he has three options. One, he can try to make it back to LaGuardia Airport. Two, he can try to make it to another airport in New Jersey called Teterboro Airport. Or three, he could try to land the plane on the Hudson River, right? Now, he figures if he tries either of the airports and doesn't make it, he will probably lose everybody on board the plane, plus people on the ground, right? So rather than put more people in danger, he decides to land on the Hudson River. And he does it successfully, right? And so that's why everybody wants to know, where did Sully land the plane? And the answer is 48th Street. So where's 48th Street? 48th Street is about as far up the river as you can see before those tall buildings on the west side block your view of the water. Okay? So it's far away, but it's not incredibly far away. If it happened right now, we would see it happening, right? Now, Captain Sullenberger did such a good job landing the plane, there were no fatalities and very few injuries. So this is what happened next. Everybody got out of the plane. This photo is an actual photo from the day of the event. All those folks standing on the wings of the floating plane. Of course, they're hoping and praying a boat comes along to save them. They did not have to wait long. Boats sped right to the scene and started rescuing the people to safety. Now, what you cannot see from these photos is how cold it was. This was a January day. It was 20 degrees out. So look at this picture here. Check out where I'm pointing. Icicles, right? Icicles. And then look at the people. They're not wearing coats, they're not wearing jackets, and they're standing up to their waist in ice water, right? But they're so happy to be alive and pumped with adrenaline. Yeah, I'm sure they're just fine with whatever temperature it is. Anyway, this story, of course, is called A Miracle on the Hudson, and they made a movie about it with Tom Hanks. It's called Sully, right? All right. So, now let's talk about Manhattan, famous Manhattan. Manhattan is an island, it's 13 miles long, it's about 20 kilometers long. We're at the downtown end, we're facing the uptown end. In front of us are low buildings. That tells us these are residential neighborhoods. Tribeca, Soho, Greenwich Village, West Village, East Village, Alphabet City, on and on and on. At around 34th Street, things change. The buildings get really tall. You'll notice there is a forest of skyscrapers from one side of Manhattan to the other, right? And it extends from 34th Street, where it starts, to 59th Street, which is the bottom edge of Central Park. And that band of tall buildings, that's called Midtown Manhattan. Midtown Manhattan. I'm sorry? Midtown Manhattan. And the most famous building in Midtown is right in the middle. It's got that pointy top, the Empire State Building. You all recognize it? Yeah, good. Okay. So the Empire State Building is at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. It was built a little over 90 years ago. I want to look as good when I'm 90 years old as that building looks today. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's a classic example of Art Deco architecture. Now, it took only 13 months to build the Empire State Building, which is astonishing. It wasn't a little building. In fact, when it was done, it was the tallest building in the world, right? It stayed the tallest building in the world for 41 years. It wasn't until they built the Twin Towers that it lost that. Now, my favorite fun fact about the Empire State Building is that when it was being designed and built, it was intended to be more than just an office building. It was also going to be an airport. An airport.
Wow.
In the 20s and 30s, wealthy people could cross the Atlantic Ocean in giant airships. They called them zeppelins or dirigibles. Gigantic blimps, right? You can imagine the Goodyear blimp times 10, right? Enormous bags of gas up there in the sky. Now the problem was, if you cross the Atlantic Ocean, hoping to come to New York City in one of these dirigibles, well, they park and let you out in a place called Lakehurst, New Jersey. Lakehurst, New Jersey is over 50 miles from Manhattan, but it was the only place with what they called a mooring mast. It's a big tower where you could park a dirigible, let the people out, right? There was a hangar to store the dirigible. There's lots of space to maneuver it, right? But when they planned the Empire State Building, they realized it towers over everything, and it could serve as a mooring mast. This is how it was supposed to work. This postcard was published while the building was being planned and built, right? They actually built the top of the Empire State Building with a space. It's a big round room, basically, where the dirigible would park, the passengers would come out into that space. Today it's being used as the upper observatory. If you go to the Empire State Building, you can go all the way to the top and you'd be in that space, which they use as their upper observatory. Anyway, so they planned it, they built it, and they tried it. Once.
Only worked once.
A U.S. Navy airship parked at the top of the Empire State Building.
Oh.
They found it to be so terrifyingly dangerous, right? With the updrafts and the winds blowing around, right? And they realized this isn't going to work. And they never tried it again. That breaks my heart. I don't live far from the Empire State Building. I'd love to go jump in the direction. Anyway, now, we see some very interesting weather here at the observatory, and about a year and a half ago we had a very interesting weather day, and I knew it was a very rare special thing, so I took a picture and I'm going to show you my picture. Check it out.
Wow.
What do you think? Pretty cool, right? Standing right where we are right now, looking out uptown. So fog rolled over the island of Manhattan. This happens about once or twice a year. So I took this in December. So we tend to have these sort of foggy, crazy days in the dead of winter. So December, January, you see this. But this, exactly what you see here, is pretty rare, right? So the reason I show this on my tours isn't to talk about the weather. It's to make a bigger point. If I took this picture 7 years ago, when the observatory first opened, right? 7 years ago, the only building you would see would be the Empire State Building, because the other buildings didn't exist.
Really?
Only 7 years ago. Whoa. Yes. Let me show you another picture. Same view, crystal clear day. Can you guys see that? Yeah. See all those yellow buildings? They were all built in a 3-year period, 2016 to 2019. It's crazy. We've had a building boom, skyscraper building boom in just the past few years.
But they're all built on the solid bedrock, right?
They all reach down to the bedrock. Yeah, yeah. The bedrock, where the buildings you see here, this is in Midtown. The bedrock is pretty close to the surface. It's pretty close to the surface. So that's not a difficulty at all. Now, some of these buildings you may have heard of or read about. This cluster over here, this is called Hudson Yards. You can see Hudson Yards on the left, right?
Vessel, right?
And so the vessel is near Hudson Yards, the shed is near Hudson Yards, and all these mixed-use buildings are on Hudson Yards as well. So Hudson Yards is called Hudson Yards because it's built over train yards called Hudson Yards. Somebody figured out, hey, if we put a ceiling over the tracks, you could still run the trains, but you'd have new real estate up there.
Yeah.
Right? And then if you build the foundations of skyscrapers in between the tracks, you could build skyscrapers and make lots of money.
Wow.
And that's what they did, right?
Wow.
But they're only half done. They still have the second half of the rail yard to cover. So there'll be more buildings growing out of Hudson Yards in the upcoming years.
Amazing.
Now, these other buildings that are closer to the Empire State Building, those towers that are sticking into the clouds, most of those are on or near 57th Street. So 57th Street is just a couple of blocks from Central Park. And you can imagine the views from the tops of those buildings into the park. $1 million views, right? And the developers know that. So what they do is they fill up those buildings or the tops of those buildings with super luxury condominiums for very, very wealthy people. And that's why they call 57th Street Billionaires Row. Billionaires Row. If you guys are billionaires, go check out some of those things. There you go. Invite me over. Anyway.
Million, not millionaires.
Billionaires, that's right. We left the billionaires behind. Now, beyond Midtown is Central Park. Can't really see it, it's too low. And then beyond Central Park are more residential neighborhoods that fill up the island of Manhattan. Eventually, a little bit past the George Washington Bridge, Manhattan comes to an end. There's a waterway called the Harlem River. And then across the Harlem River is another borough. So New York City is not just Manhattan, it's 5 different counties. We call them 5 boroughs. The borough north of Manhattan is the Bronx. It's where you find the Bronx Zoo, the New York Botanical Garden, and one of our baseball teams, the New York Yankees. They play in Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, and that's why they call them the Bronx Bombers. That's their nickname. Now, we can't see any of the Bronx because of the haze out there, but even if we had a clear day, you'd only see a blur of buildings in the distance. I couldn't point out anything in particular, but just trust me, the Bronx is up there. So we've got Manhattan, we've got the Bronx, we have 3 more boroughs to check out. So before we leave this spot, any questions about this? No? All good? All good, sir?
Yeah.
All right. So while we make our way to our next stop, just want to point out, this is the exit, okay? That doorway, that elevated doorway is where you need to go when you want to leave. You can enter from the priority exit, not a problem because you're taking my tour, or on the other side near the gift shop, which is the regular exit. Okay, so now we're facing east. The water you see in front of you, that's the East River. And across the East River, we've got 2 more boroughs. We've got Queens, and we've got a part of Brooklyn. Most of what you see is Queens, all right? So there's that cluster of tall buildings across the river. That's one corner of Queens. Everything behind that is Queens. And then imagine a giant windshield wiper from that section going all the way to JFK Airport. If you look in the distance in the haze, you see a kind of a lighter section right near the water with a strip that looks like a beach. That's JFK Airport. So all that land, 100 square miles of land, that's all Queens. Queens has JFK, it also has LaGuardia, where Sully took off from. Unfortunately, we can't see it because those tall buildings block our view of LaGuardia behind it, right? Also in Queens is Citi Field, where our other baseball team, the Mets, play. And by the way, I am not a baseball fan, but I understand the Mets are doing amazing this year.
Really?
And yeah, but now they've done this before. They start out strong, and then in the middle of the season they just crash, right? And then they end up in the cellar. Anyway, but let's just hope they keep it up. Also in Queens is Arthur Ashe Stadium, where they play the U.S. Open tennis tournament. And you can see Arthur Ashe. It's always visible because it's got that bright white, round, big domed roof over the tennis courts. Out right in the middle of Queens, yeah. Queens is one of the most ethnically diverse places in the United States. Well over 100 different foreign languages commonly spoken in Queens. People say you can eat your way around the world by dining in Queens because all those ethnic neighborhoods have restaurants that serve the cuisines of the planet. Now, closer to us is a part of Brooklyn. We'll see the rest of Brooklyn at our next stop. But this is an important part. It's got these 3 bridges that we saw in the video downstairs. So the furthest bridge, the gray bridge in the distance, is the Williamsburg Bridge. On the other side of the Williamsburg Bridge is arguably the coolest neighborhood in New York City, Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Williamsburg is home to many of our hipsters. You guys have hipsters, right? Now, I am a little too old to fit in Williamsburg, but I love Williamsburg. I think Williamsburg is terrific, and it's worth a visit if you want to do any sightseeing off the island of Manhattan. And the way I sell Williamsburg to guests like you is by describing it as being what Greenwich Village used to be in the 50s and 60s and 70s. That's what Williamsburg is today. You just walk through the streets and you get this creative, exciting vibe. The music scene, the art scene, the food scene, it's all there in Williamsburg. Now, the middle bridge is called the Manhattan Bridge. On the other side of that bridge is another cool Brooklyn neighborhood called Dumbo. Dumbo is one of those names that the real estate people invented in the 1980s. It stands for Down Under the Manhattan Bridge Overpass, right? Now, I grew up in Brooklyn as a kid. And when I was growing up, the neighborhood that is now Dumbo was a dump. It was a dangerous, dirty place. The streets were cracked. The buildings looked like they had been abandoned 100 years ago, right? And then what happened, in the middle 1980s, the artists moved in. They could get lots of space for really cheap in these big old warehouses, right? Well, once the artists move in, you know what's close behind? The real estate folks. So the real estate folks come in, that neighborhood very quickly gentrified. Turned it around. Now, Dumbo is one of the most desirable, most expensive neighborhoods in all of New York City. But another great place to visit. They got wonderful shops, restaurants, and amazing new parks right at the edge of the water. Now, the closest bridge is the Brooklyn Bridge, of course, right? Everybody knows the Brooklyn Bridge. It is the oldest of the bridges, built in 1883. It was a monumental engineering project when it was built. It took 14 years to build the Brooklyn Bridge. It cost millions of dollars, about 25 workers died getting it built. And when it was finally done, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world, by far, right? Now, these days, of course, not even close to being the longest suspension bridge in the world anymore, but arguably the prettiest bridge, at least in New York City, right? And it's a wonderful experience to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. You can walk across that bridge or bicycle or drive for free 24 hours a day. If you do choose to walk, you'll have what I think is the best time because you get an unobstructed view of the entire city. The only thing that blocks your view from the pedestrian path on the Brooklyn Bridge are the towers and the beautiful cables that come off the towers. So your obstructions are just as pretty as the view you're trying to see of the rest of the city. If you choose to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, you can reward yourself for a job well done by having some of the best pizza in New York City. There's a restaurant called Giuliana's right on the other side of the bridge. It is considered to be the #1 pizza restaurant. Giuliana's with a J. So one last thing I want to point out, because so many people ask about it, is this building right in front of us. It's made of brown stone. It's about 30 stories tall, has a white satellite dish on the roof, right?
All right.
You will notice it has no windows.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to know, what's going on? Why doesn't it have windows? Well, it doesn't have windows because it doesn't need windows. It is not an office building. It is not an apartment building. It is a phone company building. It's called the AT&T Long Lines Building. So long distance phone cables come in, they get switched, they get sent out, right? It's filled with telephone switching equipment. The only folks inside are the people who maintain the equipment, so there's no need to bring in sunshine. It's cheaper to build without windows, easier to climate control without windows, and stronger without windows. That was important when they built it in the 1970s. This was during the Cold War.
Oh.
There was a fear the Soviet Union might attack. If they did, you'd want to preserve that equipment so as not to lose communications, right? So it was important to have a very strong building. So it makes total sense that it doesn't happen. And I don't think it's a very unattractive building either. So I think they did the best they could with what they were trying to achieve. Any questions before we leave this spot? All good? All good, sir?
Oh, good. Yeah.
Okay.